Tensions between Iran, the United States and Israel have entered one of their most dangerous phases in decades, and the effects are now rippling across the global economy, regional security and international politics. In this video, we will break down how this confrontation escalated, what is happening right now and why the rest of the world cannot afford to ignore it. Imagine waking up to breaking news alerts. Hawaii-aid US-Israeli strikes hitting targets deep inside Iran, followed by Iranian missile barrages and drone attacks across the region. Oil prices spike overnight, flights are grounded across the Gulf, and stock markets from New York to Tokyo suddenly turn red. What started as a regional confrontation has now become a global shock, affecting energy supplies, trade routes, and financial stability. Today on Global Briefing, we unpack how we reached this point, what each side wants, and how this conflict is disturbing the global situation far beyond the Middle East. To understand the current crisis, we need to look briefly at the history of tensions between Iran, the United States, and Israel. Relations between Iran and the US deteriorated sharply after the 1979 Iranian Revolution, when the US-backed monarchy was overthrown and the new Islamic Republic adopted an openly anti-American and anti-Israeli stance. The hostage crisis at the US Embassy in Tehran and subsequent sanctions laid the foundation for decades of mistrust, confrontation and economic isolation. Over time, disputes over Iran's nuclear program, regional influence and support for non-state armed groups hardened Washington's view of Iran as a major strategic challenge in the Middle East. For Israel, Iran has long been perceived as its most serious external threat, especially as Tehran expanded its missile capabilities and nuclear program and built a network of allied militias across the region. Iran's support for Hezbollah in Lebanon, various armed groups in Syria and Iraq, and Palestinian factions opposed to Israel's existence created a shadow battlefield stretching from the Mediterranean to the Gulf. Israel responded with years of covert operations, cyber attacks, and targeted strikes against Iranian-linked assets, especially in Syria, trying to prevent Iran from entrenching itself militarily near Israel's borders. The nuclear file was at the heart of international diplomacy with Iran. In 2015, Iran reached a landmark nuclear agreement with major world powers, including the US, aimed at limiting its nuclear activities in exchange for sanctions relief. Supporters argued this deal reduced the risk of war and allowed for verification, while critics in Washington and Israel warned that it did not go far enough and left Iran's regional activities unchecked. When the US later withdrew and reimposed sanctions, tensions escalated again, setting off a cycle of provocation, attacks on shipping, and strikes by Iran-aligned groups across the region. The war that began in Gaza in October 2023 intensified this already fragile situation. As Israel fought Hamas, which has ties to Iran, Iranian-aligned militias stepped up attacks on US forces in Iraq and Syria and on commercial shipping in strategic waterways, framing their actions as support for Palestinians and resistance to US and Israeli policies. This created a layered confrontation, a direct war in Gaza, indirect clashes across the region, and constant concern that any miscalculation could trigger a larger conflict involving Iran itself. That larger conflict is now a reality. Recent months have seen a dramatic escalation with coordinated US-Israeli military strikes on Iran, beginning on the 28th of February 2026. These strikes targeted high-level Iranian leadership and critical infrastructure, and they reportedly included the assassination of Iran's supreme leader, Ali Khamenei, using advanced US military capabilities. The operation marked a significant shift from indirect confrontation to open, large-scale military action against the core of the Iranian state. Iran responded with a mixture of direct and indirect retaliation. It launched missiles and drones at Israeli territory and, according to regional reporting, expanded its attacks to targets in neighboring states where it perceived threats or US and Israeli presence. At the same time, Iran-aligned groups across the region intensified attacks on US bases, shipping lanes and energy infrastructure, trying to raise the cost of continued US and Israeli operations. This confrontation quickly triggered economic shockwaves. The Strait of Hormuz, a narrow maritime choke point through which roughly a fifth of globally traded oil passes, became a central vulnerability. As tensions spiked, disruptions to shipping through this strait affected about 20% of global oil supplies and pushed Brent crude prices from around $70 to above $80 per barrel in a matter of days. Analysts warned that any prolonged closure or significant damage to energy infrastructure could push prices even higher, with knock-on effects for inflation and growth worldwide. Airspace closures added another layer of disruption. Several Gulf states, including the United Arab Emirates, Qatar and Kuwait, temporarily restricted or closed portions of their airspace as a precaution against spillover from the fighting. Thousands of flights were grounded or rerouted, affecting major global airlines and hubs and causing heavy losses in aviation and tourism. SIM revenue. For a region that has invested heavily in becoming a global transport and tourism centre, the conflict directly challenged its model of stability and open connectivity. Global financial markets reacted with volatility and concern. Stock indexes in major economies registered sharp declines, with the Dow Jones Industrial Average dropping more than 400 points on the 2nd of March amid fears of wider conflict and sustained energy price spikes. Investors moved towards safer assets, and forecasters began adjusting their outlooks to account for higher inflation risks and the possibility of a slowdown or even recession if the crisis persists. For the United States, the argument put forward by officials is that the strikes on Iran were intended to deter what they describe as an escalating pattern of attacks on US personnel, allies and international shipping. Washington presents its actions as defensive and preventive, aimed at restoring deterrence, protecting freedom of navigation, and preventing Iran from achieving capabilities that could threaten regional and global stability, including advances in its nuclear and missile programs. US leaders also emphasize their commitment to Israel's security and insist that allies cannot be left to face threats alone. The United States government has stressed that it does not seek a full-scale regional war, but has signalled it is prepared to respond strongly to any attack on its forces or partners. At the same time, officials acknowledge the economic risks, yet some have publicly played down concerns about rising fuel costs, suggesting that strategic objectives take priority. Domestically, the debate centres on whether these actions enhance long-term security or risk dragging the US into another extended conflict in the Middle East. From Israel's perspective, the conflict is framed as a fight for survival against what it views as an existential threat. Israeli officials point to Iran's hostility toward Israel, its support for armed groups on Israel's borders, and its missile and nuclear programs as reasons why they see military pressure as necessary. In this view, coordinated strikes on Iranian leadership and infrastructure are designed to weaken Iran's ability to project power, disrupt profit transfers to groups such as Hezbollah, and reduce the likelihood of future large-scale attacks. Israel also argues that a robust response to Iran sends a signal to other adversaries and reassures its own population in a time of intense insecurity, especially after years of rocket attacks, cross-border clashes, and the broader fallout from the Gaza war. However, within Israel, there are also questions about the long-term consequences, including the risk of overextension, international isolation, and the danger that escalated confrontation could provoke a wider regional coalition against it. Iran, in turn, portrays itself as the victim of aggression by the United States and Israel. Iranian leaders condemn the strikes, especially the killing of the supreme leader, as illegal, destabilizing, and a violation of sovereignty. They argue that their response is legitimate self-defense and that they are resisting attempts by foreign powers to dominate the region and undermine Iran's independence. Tehran also highlights its alliances with armed groups and regional partners as part of what it calls an axis of resistance against US and Israeli influence. While critics see these networks as tools for destabilization, Iran frames them as deterrence assets that can raise the cost of any attack on Iran itself. At home, the loss of the supreme leader is a profound shock, and the leadership transition adds uncertainty about how unified and stable Iran's response will be in the coming months. Regional Arab states, especially the Gulf, are watching developments with anxiety and caution. Many of them have tried tried in recent years to reduce tensions, diversify their economies and present themselves as hubs of trade, tourism and investment. A prolonged war risks undermining this strategy by threatening energy infrastructure, tourism and investor confidence. While some Gulf governments privately share concerns about Iran's regional behaviour, they are also wary of being drawn into a direct confrontation or seeing their territory used as a launching pad, which could make them targets. At the same time, these states must balance relations with the United States, a traditional security partner, and with major Asian customers such as China, which depend heavily on Gulf energy. Their responses will likely focus on strengthening defences, engaging in quiet diplomacy and trying to keep channels open with all sides to reduce the risk of miscalculation. Major global powers outside the region are also heavily invested in how this crisis unfolds. China, which has significant energy and infrastructure investments in the Gulf and relies on the region for a large share of its oil imports, has clear incentives to prevent a prolonged disruption. Analysts expect Beijing to increase its diplomatic engagement, potentially positioning itself as a mediator or at least a voice pushing for de-escalation to safeguard its economic interests. Russia, facing its own confrontations with the West and seeking opportunities to expand arms sales and influence, may view the conflict differently. Moscow could use the turmoil to deepen ties with Iran, offer military equipment and benefit from higher energy prices while highlighting Western involvement in another Middle Eastern war. However, it must also manage the risk that wider instability might affect its own interests in Syria and its relations with regional actors. For Europe and other import-dependent regions, the main concern is the combination of energy security, economic stability and migration pressures. Higher oil and gas prices can complicate efforts to control inflation and recover from previous economic shocks, while renewed conflict raises the prospect of new refugee flows if fighting intensifies or spreads. European governments have often advocated for diplomatic engagement with Iran to reduce tensions and prevent nuclear escalation, and they now face renewed pressure to play a mediating role. Beyond energy markets, the conflict is unsettling global trade networks and supply chains. The Middle East sits astride several key maritime routes, including not just the Strait of Hormuz, but also connections to the Red Sea, the Suez connections to the Red Sea, the Suez connections. When shipping companies perceive higher risk, they may reroute vessels, pay higher insurance premiums, or delay voyages, all of which add costs that can eventually reach consumers worldwide. Aviation and tourism, especially in the Gulf and broader Middle East, also come under pressure during periods of heightened risk. Airlines that rely on major regional hubs must adjust routes, and travellers may postpone trips to or through the region. For countries that have invested heavily in becoming global travel and business centres, this conflict directly challenges their economic plans. Financial markets respond not just to immediate events, but to expectations about the future. If investors believe the conflict could drag on or expand, they may reduce exposure to riskier assets, which can tighten financial conditions globally. Central banks, already balancing inflation control with growth, must now factor in the possibility of energy-driven price spikes and potential slowdowns linked to geopolitical uncertainty. In addition to economic consequences, the conflict raises avowed questions for international law and global norms. Targeted killings of top state leaders and cross-border strikes on sovereign territory fuel debates about the legality of such actions, the thresholds for self-defence, and the risk that precedent could normalise similar operations elsewhere. The use of proxy forces and attacks on civilian shipping complicate accountability, making it harder to enforce rules designed to protect civilian trade and non-combatants. There is also a risk that sectarian and ideological divisions could deepen if the conflict is framed in religious or civilizational terms. That narrative can inflame tensions far beyond the region, affecting communities and politics in Europe, Asia, and the Americas. Managing the messaging and avoiding dehumanizing language will be critical to prevent wider social polarization. At the heart of the global concern is the potential for miscalculation. When multiple actors operate with high levels of mistrust, limited communication and overlapping red lines, even a single incident, a misfired missile, a mistaken attribution or an accident at sea could trigger a chain reaction. Nuclear proliferation concerns add another layer, as the breakdown of diplomatic frameworks might push states to reconsider their security strategies. In this environment, diplomacy becomes both more difficult and more essential. Some states and international organizations are likely to push for immediate de-escalation measures, ceasefires, back-channel talks and confidence-building steps such as reopening communication lines or setting rules to avoid incidents at sea and in the air. Others will focus on longer-term issues, including revisiting nuclear constraints, regional security frameworks and mechanisms to address the concerns of all parties without resorting to open war. For ordinary people around the world, this crisis may feel distant, but its consequences are not. Rising fuel and transport costs can translate into higher prices for basic goods, from food to electricity, especially in countries that are highly dependent on energy imports. Regions already facing economic stress or political instability are particularly vulnerable to new shocks that may inflame unrest or weaken fragile governments. Communities with ties to the region may also experience heightened anxiety and, in some cases, an increase in political tensions or discrimination. Media narratives and online discourse can amplify fears, spread misinformation, or deepen divisions if not handled carefully and responsibly. That is why accurate, balanced, and nuanced coverage of the conflict is crucial. Stepping back, the confrontation between Iran, the United States, and Israel is not just a local or even regional dispute. It sits at the crossroads of energy security, great power competition, regional rivalries, and debates about international law and the use of force. How it is handled will influence not only the future of the Middle East, but also the global economy and the broader international order. Managing this crisis will require a combination of restraint, diplomacy, and clear-eyed recognition of the costs of escalation. While states will continue to pursue their interests and security, the interconnected nature of today's world means that prolonged conflict in one region cannot be neatly contained. In the coming weeks and months, the choices made in Washington, Tehran, Jerusalem, and other capitals will shape not just regional outcomes, but the global situation that all of us share. You've been watching Global Briefing, where we break down complex events shaping our world. Stay informed, stay critical, and join us next time for deeper insight into global affairs.